afternoon. Welcome to the opening weekend of the exhibition, After Removal, the Rebuilding of the Cherokee Nation. This exhibition features artwork, artifacts, and manuscripts that illustrate the most pivotal episode in Cherokee history, the forced removal to Indian Territory. This exhibition covers the causes and consequences of Indian removal and highlights the political debates that led to removal, the internal fighting and factionalism that was a result of removal, and the ultimate rebuilding of the Cherokee Nation. And here to talk more about this is Cherokee scholar Candessa Tehee. Candessa Tehee is a full-blood Cherokee who grew up in a close-knit traditional Cherokee community where Cherokee language and culture was a mainstay. From 2013 to 2016, Condessa was the executive director of the Cherokee Heritage Center in Park Hill, Oklahoma. Through her administrative duties and leadership, Condessa was able to guide the Cherokee Heritage Center in its mission to preserve, promote, and teach Cherokee history, heritage, and culture. Condessa is currently a Cherokee language professor at Northeastern State University in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. Condessa earned her Bachelor of Arts in Native American Studies and Communications, a Master's of Education, and a Ph.D. in Sociocultural and Linguistic Anthropology at the University of Oklahoma. In addition to her academic and career pursuits, Condessa is also an award-winning weaver who carries on the tribal and family tradition of finger weaving and loom weaving. Please help me welcome Candessa Tehee.
OCO. Osnitdag. Candessa Tehee dawado yonig, he dawado jalog, kali jalagi talaqua ginela. Juhedla di kalaga skadugi jindeshquas dagi lostane. Gully Alici, Natalie, and the Gilcrease Museum. So I am Candessa Tehee, that's how you say my name in English, and I'm Ia in Cherokee. And as Natalie said, I am a full-blood Cherokee. I live in Tahlequah. I work at Northeastern State University. And I'm very grateful for the invitation to come today and speak at the opening of the exhibit, After Removal, Rebuilding the Cherokee Nation. I was part of the From Rebirth to Renewal Symposium in April 2016, organized by Dr. Dwayne King, that preceded this exhibit. I was humbled and honored to have been included in that group of excellent scholars, and I'm excited to be part of the continuing conversation, continuing dialogue in association with the exhibit. So first of all, I want to begin by saying Gali Heliga Jije Donha, and that means I'm happy you're all here today. I know that all of us care very deeply about Cherokee history, and we're all people with a passion for talking openly about all facets of history. So I'm very glad you all chose to be here today to hear my remarks. Okay, so the title of my talk is Resisting Removal and Rebuilding the Cherokee Nation. I will begin by examining some key events, some that are prior to Indian removal, and I will continue by speaking about women's anti-removal petitions. And then I will discuss how Cherokee women appear in the historical narrative within and just prior to this particular era. So I will start off with a few key events. As we all know, the original Cherokee homelands are located in the east and once encompassed parts of present-day North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia. However, as this map by James Mooney shows, the blue line is the limit of the original Cherokee land claims, which you can see outlined here. The red line is the boundary of Cherokee land claims at Revolution. The green line is the Cherokee boundary at final land cession, and this map was done by James Mooney in 1900. So what this illustrates is the vast amount of territory seized by the American government, relegating Cherokee people to but a small fraction of their original territories. So between the Revolution and what Mooney terms the final land cession, Cherokee people known as Old Settlers began immigrating to the west into Arkansas as early as 1782. After a 2.2 million acre land cession in the Treaty of 1817, Spring Frog, depicted here, was one of the signatories of the Treaty of 1817. Cherokees began voluntarily, and I use that word somewhat facetiously, moving west in the face of extreme pressure from state governments and encroaching white settlers. These immigrations continued, with Emmett Starr stating that formal moves to Indian Territory continued on into 1828 and 1829. So despite these early immigrations, the vast majority of Cherokee people were averse to trading their homelands in the east for lands in the west, despite mounting political pressure from all sides. Yet, as pressures mounted, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 was passed at the behest of President Andrew Jackson, who was elected in 1824. This led to much tumult among indigenous nations. Within the Cherokee Nation, there was severe disagreement over the course of action to be taken. A group of men took it upon themselves to sign the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, ceding the southeastern homelands. Although land cessions were forbidden, and each of the signatories knew they were signing their death warrant. Elias Boudinot, in justification of the treaty and of his own action in signing it, in a pamphlet address stated, and these are Elias Boudinot's words here, "We cannot conceive of the acts of a minority to be so reprehensible and unjust are represented by Mr. Ross. If 100 persons are ignorant of their true situation and are so completely blinded as to not see the destruction that awaits them, we can see strong reasons to justify the actions of a minority of 50 persons to do what the majority would do if they understood their condition, to save a nation from political thraldom and moral degradation." So he was very sure that what he was doing was completely justified. He felt as though he was saving the Cherokee Nation from ruination by signing the Treaty of New Echota, although he knew he was in the minority and that he was acting in a manner that was not in accordance with Cherokee Nation law. So Boudinot is utterly certain that his and the other signers of the Treaty of New Echota were saving the Cherokee Nation. On the other side of the issue, Chief John Ross was continuing to encourage Cherokees to plant their corn until 1838, when soldiers began rounding Cherokees up into stockades. Some argue that Ross also knew removal was inevitable and that he was seeking to better the Cherokee position through his negotiation tactics. Regardless, each side of the issue thought they were doing the right thing. Nevertheless, Indian removal occurred, and it did not occur just for Cherokee people. It occurred throughout the Southeast, and Indians from other geographic regions were also sent to Indian Territory as well, which you can see here illustrated in this graph. A number of different tribal nations were sent to Oklahoma, which now today leads us to having 39 different federally recognized nations within the state of Oklahoma. Genealogical research from my own family shows paternal ancestors who were on the Binge detachment during the Trail of Tears. Family oral history also says that maternal ancestors were part of groups immigrating prior to this event as part of the early immigrations. The same oral history tells that the forced removal for my maternal ancestors was something that was foreseen as an inevitable and tragic event. Therefore, these maternal ancestors, along with some other like-minded Cherokees, chose to leave Jalaguet, and Jalagueting is like the ancient Cherokee place, basically. So they chose to leave Jalaguet, settling ultimately in the present-day Sequoia County area. So these diverse narratives are commonplace in Cherokee history and are indicative of how Cherokee people took multiple routes to arrive in Indian Territory. Even on the trail, that journey had 4 different routes that could possibly be taken. Reverend Stephen Foreman and his wife Sarah Riley were rounded up and sent to Camp Hetzel. They survived the roundup in the east and Camp Hetzel and the ensuing Trail of Tears journey. However, that journey took 4 months. During the 4-month journey, they were slowed by rainy weather, bad roads, and they saw the deaths of many elders. Fly Smith and White Path were included in the casualties. Stephen Foreman's wife gave birth on the trail as they journeyed. And the thing that blew my mind was that it was one of 19 children born on that detachment alone. Can you imagine having your child under those conditions? During the journey, they were forced to make camp at Clear Camp Creek in Illinois because of ice running on the Mississippi. So Clear Camp Creek was about 4 miles away from the Mississippi. The ice held up the Foreman and Bushy Head detachments, leading to the camp swelling to an estimated 2,000 persons, which the site, of course, was ill-equipped to handle. The close quarters and the ill-equipped site led to disease and an increased mortality rate among those who were camped there waiting for the ice to recede. And an interesting note, the Foreman detachment did not travel on the Sabbath. So they traveled 6 out of 7 days of the week. Although many white settlers were eagerly awaiting their chance to gain an individual title to Cherokee lands for a small fee, as evidenced in Zilla Haney Brandon's memoir covering the years 1830 to 1838. She writes, and these are her words, "The weather was excessively cold, but on the 6th day after our departure, we arrived at the place of our destination and found a family of Indians occupying our house." Emphasis is hers. Which, by the way, was a very poor one without floor or loft. The Indians set about moving out, though, with looks as magisterial as if they had been kings seated upon thrones, in royal robes with a retinue about them leaning upon the scepters. They would not deign to look at us, much less speak to us. That, though, was characteristic of that people. They are seldom known to speak to strangers that are among the white people. So we can imagine how that family may have felt. Although Brandon goes on to write that she felt sympathy for the Cherokee people whom she had displaced from their home, which, it will comfort you to know, she received their home with a grateful heart, she writes. Her family kept as treasured mementos the bows and blowguns given to her family by those Cherokees, those same Cherokees that had been displaced now. When the time for removal came, they gave bows and blowguns to her family. So they treasured those as keepsakes, held on to them as heirlooms within the family. Despite this and other similar stories, notable figures such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, pictured here, did entreat President Martin Van Buren on behalf of the Cherokee people, because Martin Van Buren was in office at the time that removal was actually carried out. Emerson wrote a letter in 1836 calling for justice in the, quote, vast outrage upon the Cherokee nation. Yet despite growing national sentiment of the great injustice being perpetrated, the act of removal did carry forward. Removal was an arduous process that led to the loss of 1/4 of the Cherokee people due to hardship and disease. When I worked as executive director of the Cherokee Heritage Center, I had the great fortune of working with Jerry Clark. Jerry Clark is a treasure trove of information, and he spent his lifetime working in Washington, D.C. at the National Archives, retiring there and then coming home to Cherokee Nation shortly after his retirement. Now he is pretty much a full-time volunteer at the Cherokee Heritage Center and is a treasure trove of knowledge about Cherokee history, genealogy, and another number of other topics. So he's great. He's a great person to visit with, and he has a ton of stories. Well, he was working on compiling the actual names of individuals who perished along the trail. He was using the detachment rosters, muster rolls, ration lists, and any other kind of documents that could possibly shed some light on this. So the sheer number of names that he had was just overwhelming. And so as he and I sat and looked at this list, he asked me, is there anything you notice? Is there anything that sticks out to you? Well, of course, when I saw some of the names are still carried by families in Cherokee Nation. And that was what I said. Mr. Clark grinned at me and he said, look again. So I looked again, and searching for what he wanted me to see. And then finally he says, look at the ages of the people who died. At that point, with his guidance, I saw that the ages for the deceased were mostly elderly and very, very young. The most vulnerable of our Cherokee people were the ones most gravely affected by what Wanino called the sham treaty and the removal of our people to Indian Territory. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Cherokee people did immigrate to Indian Territory early. However, the land we now call Oklahoma was already home to several indigenous peoples. Represented here in approximate land bases and divided by language family, the Osage, Caddo, Wichita, Plains Apache, Kiowa, Comanche, Arapaho, and Jicarilla Apache were all indigenous to this area prior to European contact. In 1759, in fact, the Wichita people repelled the Spanish attack in the Battle of the Twin Villages. From the vantage of a two-story structure, it's a two-story structure, that housed an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 Wichita. It had a deep water moat surrounding it because it was on the bank of the Red River. The Wichita laughed while the Spanish fired cannons because they had no effect. And they repelled each advance of the Spanish on all sides. So despite these advanced indigenous settlements in Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma, you see an individual like Josiah Gregg in 1839 writing, "There was not a regularly laid out town in all the Indian country, and no place that could even merit the name of a village except for Doaksville near Fort Towson and perhaps Park Hill," according to Carolyn Thomas Foreman. So it's the combination of imperialism, the dismissal of indigenous ways of living evident in Gregg's accounts of the area that led him to the conclusion that there was nothing in the area that even merited being called a village save these two places. Gregg was also impressed with the contrast between an occasional stately dwelling with an extensive farm attached, and in his word, the miserable homes of the indigent. So despite already being occupied, Indian Territory, Martin Van Buren issued a Cherokee land patent whose opening line reads, "The United States agrees to possess the Cherokees and to guarantee it to them forever, and that guarantee is hereby pledged of 7 million acres of land." I'm from the government, you can trust me. Of course, we all know that that unmolested title to land did not last very long. So removal occurred between 1838 and 1839, and it was a terrible event in American and Cherokee history. John Ross was principal chief during the tumultuous years that led to removal and entered Indian Territory with Cherokees traveling from the east who were seeking to make new homes. His Cherokee name was Gooey Scooey. He was of Scottish and Cherokee descent and was chief from 1828 until his death in 1866. He was a leader during a time period in Cherokee history that saw the devastation of Indian removal, the rebuilding of the nation, and then the Civil War a mere 25 years later. Although only 1/8 Cherokee, he gained his Cherokee descent through his mother, grew up bilingual, and also had a formal education. So, by old measures of Cherokee citizenship, he met those. And he continues to be the longest serving chief of Cherokee Nation. Ross's first wife, Quady, perished during her journey to Indian Territory, and Ross arrived to Indian Territory a widower. So upon arrival in Indian Territory, there was great unrest and tension. The old settlers had established government, and there were controversies between those who had immigrated on the trail and those who had immigrated early. So Sequoia, an old settler who also invented the Cherokee writing system known as a syllabary in 1821, depicted here. And here is a sample of the Cherokee writing system. You see to the left-hand side a curvilinear form. That was the original form of the syllabary, which actually had over 100 characters. It was then later adapted for print and reduced to the 86 characters that we know today. So on the left-hand side is the original curvilinear form. On the right-hand side is the adaptation for the printing press. And this is courtesy of the Gilcrease Museum and is held here within their collections. The John Howard Payne papers, I believe. So Sequoia and George Lowry was a firm opponent of immigration. Sequoia had immigrated early, and they were co-presidents of the convention to negotiate union between Eastern and Western Cherokees. The Act of Union was successfully negotiated and signed on July 12, 1839. However, despite an act of union, the tensions between the Ross and treaty parties continued. Elias Boudinot, editor of the Cherokee Phoenix, and Samuel Worcester, who operated both the Cherokee National Press and a mission there in Park Hill, are almost inextricably intertwined. Samuel Worcester arrived in Indian Territory in 1835, first at Dwight Mission, then to Union Mission. However, Worcester soon petitioned the Cherokee National Council to pass an act authorizing the establishment of the press at or near the station occupied by Mr. Newton near the fork of the Illinois. Worcester promised not to meddle in the political affairs of the nation and stated his intention to hire Elias Boudinot as his printer. It was allowed, and in 1836, Worcester moved his family, and then in 1837, the press followed Park Hill under the strict instruction that he was limited to the use of 5 acres of land, and that the animals held at the mission could never exceed 25 cows and 60 hogs. So I like to imagine there was an official hog counter in Cherokee Nation during that period of time. In 1834, John Foster Wheeler, Worcester's printer, and his wife, Nancy Wadey, and that name rings a bell, right? Nancy Wadey, moved to Indian Territory and later to Park Hill with Worcester, along with John Walker Candy, another printer, along with his wife, Mary Ann Wadey. The women were both sisters of Elias Boudinot, making the 3 printers brothers-in-law. However, Boudinot's actions in signing the Treaty of New Echota, which again was referred to by Waninohe as a sham treaty, and Waninohe is actually, I think, George Lowry's granddaughter. His actions made him none too popular, and his engagement by Worcester was none too popular either. In a letter to John Ross, Worcester wrote, "It is possible the council will be so offended with me as to pass an order for my removal from the nation. We feel much interested to retain Mr. Boudinot because there is no other to compare with him in qualifications for my work." Ross did not recommend Boudinot's removal, and Worcester believed Boudinot would eventually be forgiven for his part in removal. Spoiler alert, this was false. On June 22, 1839, while working on the construction of his home in Park Hill, a mile from Worcester's home and approximately 2 miles from Rose Cottage, Elias Boudinot was called away by 3 men. They approached, telling Boudinot that they needed his help to get medicine for an illness and needed him to accompany them to Worcester's home. Boudinot left with them. Halfway to Worcester's house, he was set upon with a knife and tomahawks and was killed. The hired men, hearing a commotion, made their way to the place to find him expired. They quickly called for Worcester, who upon seeing the scene is said to have cried out, "They have cut off my right hand." When I hear, it struck me for a long time that this is what Worcester cried out at the height of his grief. They have cut off my right hand. A pessimistic view of that statement would say that he viewed Elias Boudinot as a tool. Instead of thinking, my friend lost his life, his children will now be fatherless, they have cut off my right hand. One of the assailants threw the bloody knife into Archibald Campbell's yard, which was half a mile west of the site of the execution. Worcester's son rode his father's fastest horse, named Comet, to Stanwady's store a mile from Park Hill and warned him of the incident, possibly saving Wady's life. Wady took Comet and immediately fled. The story is that Worcester's son loudly inquired and bargained over the price of sugar, while in low tones telling Wady of Boudinot's execution. Wady went on to escape that day and another day as witnessed by Mary Worcester, who is Samuel Worcester's daughter. John Foster Wheeler and Worcester were neighbored with an orchard between their two properties, and that orchard had a sinkhole, and they had covered the sinkhole with saplings to warn people that it was there and to warn animals of its presence. Wady heard a group of mounted men and made his way to the sinkhole, where using only his arms, he crossed to the middle and lowered himself inside, where he waited for the men to pass. And now that is some Cherokee Ninja Warrior. I don't know if you guys watch that show or not, but I mean, they are, those men and women who do that are just phenomenal. And, you know, I'm fairly young, but I don't know if I could lower myself using only my arms in and out into a sinkhole. So he waited for the men to pass. It was said that the group of men numbered somewhere around 50. Once they passed, he exited and went to his sister's, Nancy Wady Wheeler's home, which had just been searched. Boudinot was later buried in Worcester Cemetery in an unmarked grave covered by a heavy slab, not far from where he had been executed. Approximately 200 people died. Oh, and I'm sorry, these are actually pieces that were printed at the Mission Press at Park Hill. They were printed in 1846, but they're nice examples of the printing that was done there in Park Hill. So approximately 200 people died in the violent aftermath of the executions that occurred on June 22nd, 1839. But I had, for years and years, thought that the unrest and the assassinations and the executions that occurred, I thought they probably went into the 1840s, but I didn't realize just how far they went to the 1840s. In the 1840s, Mary Ryder was left with the task of burying her son, Sewell Ryder, by herself because all of her male relatives in the family had fled to Arkansas. John Tato walked into the kitchen and led Sewell into the yard before the group opened fire. He was shot 7 times. He tried to escape but was chased down by a man named Big Stand and stabbed to death. Sewell's mother, Mary Wood or Ryder, later stated that after they shot Sewell, a man shot at another of her sons, only 16 years of age, and missed. Tuco had ordered the boy not be killed because he believed him to be white. Her son had belonged to the Old Settler and Treaty Party. Then, in 1845, Charles Smith was dragged from bed at his mother's house near White Oak Springs in the Tahlequah district, shot to death in the front yard by a posse of 5 or 6 men, presumably light horsemen, led by the lieutenant's cousin, also named John Brown. So the fallout from removal was widespread with deep enmity on both sides. Consequences were suffered by those who sometimes had no hand in the treaty itself. Boudinot's widow, Delight Sargent, continued to serve as a stepmother to his now orphaned 6 children. They were the children of Boudinot and his previously departed first wife, Elizabeth Gold. Delight Sargent wrote a letter to President James K. Polk that is now held in the Cherokee National Archives. She speaks of her impoverished state and entreats for the U.S. government to mete out justice in Boudinot's death. She explicitly requests remuneration because Boudinot met his end as a result of service to the U.S. and his signature on the Treaty of New Echota. It left her alone to care for his 6 children without any means to do so because at the time of his death, Boudinot left nothing behind. Worcester had appealed to the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions to grant the impoverished Boudinot $500 to build the home that he was constructing in Park Hill when he was killed. So there were people that made money off removal, but Elias Boudinot was not one of them. Despite the great loss of Boudinot, the printing at Park Hill continued when Stephen Foreman, a bilingual Cherokee, took Boudinot's place until Worcester's death. Under Worcester's tenure, the press at Park Hill, with the aid of his translators and faithful printers, produced 13,980,000 pages of text. The continued printing is symbolic of the rebuilding efforts that took place during this time. So what you see here is Rose Cottage, and I think I got off on one of my slides, sorry about that. Rose Cottage in Park Hill was the home of John Ross and his second wife, Mary Stapler Ross. This is an image of the original hand-tinted daguerreotype of the couple held in the Cherokee National Archives located at the Cherokee Heritage Center. The person who operated the daguerreotype machine is not known. John McStanley may have taken it, as some posit. However, there was also a daguerreotype machine that was offered for sale by Lorenzo Delano, one-time postmaster at Park Hill, and brother Charles Delano, one-time superintendent of the Cherokee National Female Seminary. He says, in print, a superior daguerreotype machine for sale in spring of 1846, and he lists Park Hill as his residence. But regardless of who captured the image, it offers a fine and rare glimpse of the couple sometime after their marriage in 1844, when John was 55 and Mary was 18. It probably would raise a couple eyebrows still today, right? So Rose Cottage was named for the roses that were planted surrounding the home and many varieties collected by Ross during his travels. The 1.5 mile long driveway lined with roses led to a mansion of classical design large enough to support 40 guests comfortably. John Howard Payne wrote that during his visit, Rose Cottage regularly accommodated 25 to 50 and had stables and slave cabins on 1,000 acres. In addition to those amenities, Rose Cottage also boasted an apple orchard with 1,000 trees, a greenhouse, a dairy, a blacksmith shop, and a smokehouse. In the Andrew Nave collection at Northeastern State University in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, we are offered a rare glimpse into the life of one slave at Rose Cottage. A slave named Archie seemed to have been Ross's favorite messenger, with documents indicating that Archie and his mother, described as a mulatto woman, were acquired from J.D. Mulkey, September 1st, 1954, in trade for a 26-year-old man from Ross. Now, there are those who will maintain that Cherokee slaves were treated with greater consideration and care than those of their white neighbors. However, this does not lessen the inhumanity or the legacy of chattel slavery in Cherokee history. Even if you say the Cherokee were contextually kinder in some instances, there is still ample evidence from the work of scholar Ty Miles' research into the Van Plantation that this was not the case across the board. Then when one couples information from Miles, along with Waninohe's account of George Lowry's longtime and trusted slave being shamed for eating his master's watermelons, a more complex picture of life for the slaves of Cherokee Nation emerges. Slavery was by no means common in Cherokee Nation as a whole. Park Hill was home to the plantation class of Cherokee people, and this reality can hardly be ignored, especially in discussion of large, luxurious homes like Rose Cottage and the Hunter's Home or Merle Home depicted here. And here. The original Cherokee National Female Seminary was built in 1851 and served as the first institution for higher education for women west of the Mississippi and was patterned after Mount Holyoke. The comparison was further strengthened when the female seminary hired teachers educated at Mount Holyoke. The Cherokee Nation had a robust school system of which the Cherokee male and female seminaries were part. Unique for its time period, the teachers at the Cherokee male and female seminaries were paid an equal rate. Chief John Ross reported in 1855 that the instructors at the male seminary complained about being paid the same as the women at the female seminary. Poor guys. But Ross dryly noted that the women had never interposed any objection. And that's from Devin Mehesua's wonderful book, Cultivating the Rosebuds. The Cherokee National Female Seminary served to educate Cherokee women, reserving a number of spots for those who could not afford to pay the fees. But despite being open to all Cherokee women, the full-blood girls typically stayed on the top floor and kept to themselves. Mehesua, again, notes, critics of the school charged that the seminaries were elitist and racist toward full-bloods and traditional Cherokees, because the seminary's newspapers were sold not only to seminarians, but also to the nation's citizens. The viewpoints of the male and female students who believed that those Cherokees who possessed lighter hair and lighter skin were superior to darker girls, and especially to those who were traditionalists, were widely known and not always appreciated. Despite the intense emphasis on acculturation in the curriculum and the devaluing of Cherokee lifeways and culture, the school continues to be celebrated largely without critical analysis outside of Mehesua's. On Easter Sunday in 1887, the Cherokee National Female Seminary burned to the ground due to the errant embers from the pipe of a traveling preacher. Today, only 3 columns remain standing at the former, the picture's not coming up. Oh, there it is, okay. Remains standing at its former site, which is now the Cherokee Heritage Center, a nonprofit organization that houses the Cherokee National Museum and Cherokee National Archives with the mission to preserve, promote, and teach Cherokee history, heritage, and culture. And currently, the Cherokee Homecoming Art Show and Sale is up there and will be up for, I think, the next month. So if you're interested in art made by United Kituah Band, Eastern Band, and Cherokee Nation citizens, you might want to make your way to Tahlequah and check that out. They also have an online gallery on Facebook if you can't make it. So the female seminary was later rebuilt at what is now the site of Northeastern University. So the Cherokee Nation continues today with over 315,000 citizens, but the legacy of the past is always with us. I have heard Cherokees in modern day, within the past few years actually, attempt to deny that slavery was a practice, attempt to deny that slavery, that slaves also traveled with us on the Trail of Tears. There is reference in documents associated with the Trail of Tears saying that so-and-so and his boy helped in the burial of certain individuals. And in that day and time, referring to an individual as someone's boy typically meant that that individual was a slave. So we cannot rationalize it, we cannot deny it, we have to look at it full on. We can't use an apologist narrative that Cherokee slave owners were kinder or more generous in some way to excuse the chattel slavery that was taking place. Ample evidence exists in the historical record to counter these types of euphemistic narratives, and we can't ignore how this history contributes to continuing anti-Blackness in Cherokee communities and in Indian country. And that leads to the erasure of Black Indians who exist on the margins of both communities. Other items in the historical narrative that should be interrogated are the ways in which women appear, but more often the ways in which women don't appear. So after the Indian Removal Act was passed in 1830 and the Treaty of New Echota was signed in 1835, calls for Indian removal were made by President Thomas Jefferson as much as 3 decades prior, with some authors calling him the actual architect of Indian removal. In May 1817, a group of women led by Nancy Ward, one of the last known beloved women, argued against any land cessions or immigration, stating, "The Cherokee ladies now being present at the meeting of the chiefs and warriors in council have thought it their duty as mothers to address their beloved chiefs and warriors. We have raised you all on the land which we now have, which God gave to us to inhabit and raise provisions. Your mothers and your sisters beg of you not to part with any more of our land." It concludes with Nancy Ward to her children. Scholar Taya Miles theorizes that the authors are evoking a shared female consciousness and marking all the men at the gathering as their collective descendants. She goes on to state that the women make a correlation between matricide and immigration or land cession by stating that the act of going over the Mississippi to an unknown country would be like, quote, destroying your mothers. So despite this impassioned plea resting on the power of women, motherhood, and the Cherokee tradition of matrilineal descent in which children and descendants belong to the women, the Treaty of 1817 was signed in July and ceded 2.2 million acres. The treaty also gave people a choice. They could either accept an allotment and destroy communal land title or move to Arkansas. So Cherokee people very, very logically decided that if they don't choose either option, the treaty must not be binding. I think that sounds like solid logic. But the U.S. government disagreed and ruled the treaty binding. So in response to this alarming development, the women issued another petition in 1818, and this time used the evidence of Christianity as a tactic for persuasion, but it also went unheeded. So these petitions show coherent organization by women along traditional lines through a women's council that presented their recommendation to the men's council. Despite this evidence, Cherokee governmental organization followed Western norms and completely disenfranchised women's voices. No women were part of the 1827 Constitutional Convention, and the resulting constitution made it illegal for women to vote or hold office. Cherokees had gone from being mocked by Adair in 1775 for having a petticoat government in which women had full political voice to mimicking Western notions that women had no such rights. According to Carolyn Johnston, by the 1800s, the Cherokees had lost their independence and had become dominated by white Americans. At this time, white Americans did not believe it was proper for women to fight wars, vote, speak in public, work outside the home, or even control their own children. Cherokees began to imitate whites, and Cherokee women lost much of their power and prestige. In the 20th century, they had to struggle, along with other women, to acquire back many of the rights that Cherokee women had once freely enjoyed. And this is a piece by a friend, America Meredith, Swedish and Cherokee. It's egg tempera on masonite, 7 inches by 5 inches, of Ola Duck, a Cherokee girl. So now, as a full-blooded Cherokee woman raised in a traditional community with an outlet for my political voice in my community, I always attempt to offer the voices and stories of women of color in conjunction or sometimes in place of men's stories, because so often the focus of broad historical narratives is men's stories and men's voices. And there's nothing wrong with hearing those things. But I believe in a multitude of stories. And if we're only hearing one version of the narrative, you have to wonder what other experiences were. So I don't advocate for the removal of men's narratives from the historical from history, I advocate for the addition, the amendment and the addition of women's voices into that same fray. So in the case of removal and renewal, women's voices and stories seem to exist on the periphery, if at all. Women's existence and struggles are hinted at in the statistic that 19 children were born on a detachment during the Trail of Tears. They are hinted at in an anti-removal petition highlighting that the male decision makers are descendants of a collective womanhood. In the statement that a woman must bury her son alone in the wake of another Treaty Ross Party assassination, women's stories are hinted at. In a widow's letter entreating for monetary assistance to raise her 6 stepchildren. Cherokee society, with its deep history of matrilineal descent, makes a sudden and sharp departure, especially once prominent men begin marrying non-Cherokee wives. This leads to the installation of bilateral descent as a way to determine citizenship, where before matrilineality was a requirement. At one point, a bifurcated system of ownership existed where land was held in common, but an individual owned their personal items, except, according to Theta Purdue, women who had no need for personal ownership and preferred a common system of ownership of cooking utensils and household items that existed along the matriline. So I read these accounts and note the fervor at which acculturation was embraced and championed by some Cherokee people. I see a hostile intolerance toward what was at times characterized as full-blood beliefs and behaviors, and it should at this point be noted, full-blood was and continues to be a social designation rather than one strictly of blood or biology. I myself am part white and I can't prove it. It is more strongly associated with lifeways, including the use of Cherokee language, place of residence, clan affiliation, and phenotype, rather than strict blood quantum. The gentrification at work that displaced Cherokee women from traditional roles of leadership only became more pronounced as time went on, and much of the Cherokee Golden Age between the end of the removal era and the beginning of the Civil War is marked by such idiosyncrasies as paying men and women an equal wage for teaching at the seminaries, while using the seminaries as a way to acculturate young women and men into non-Cherokee values and beliefs. Vast displays of wealth, slaves owned, and lifestyles present in gentrified hamlets like Park Hill were not typical of Cherokee lifeways or even of the time period. Yet an atypical social and political elite significantly shaped and influenced the course of Cherokee American history. Regardless, these things should serve as reminders, ultimately, of the resilience and skillful adaptation of Cherokee people to swiftly changing circumstances. And we do see, especially with John Ross freeing his slaves 10 years prior to the passage of the 13th Amendment at the urging of his wife Mary Stapler, that Cherokee people's minds can be changed and for the better. Nevertheless, as contemporary students and scholars of history, we cannot look away from the more distasteful parts of our history lest we begin as a whole to forget its lessons. Dealing with legacies of anti-blackness and misogyny are important steps in this process. Recognizing that the 1835 census showed 1,592 slaves owned by 300 Cherokees, and that a lot of this renewal that we talk about was done on the backs of slaves. Those who had access to a ready supply of labor were able to clear land, construct homes and farm buildings sooner, and engage in other economic enterprises more readily. So the economic disparity between the Cherokee elite and the masses grew in tandem with slavery. By 1860, approximately 10% or 400 out of 4,200 Cherokee families owned slaves. At that time, the Cherokee population was 21,000 and the slave population was 3,500 to 4,000, which is significant. In the mid-1850s, slavery did emerge as one of the most divisive issues in Cherokee politics. So it's important to acknowledge these uncomfortable truths, and with exhibits and conversations like these, seek to educate and share all facets of Cherokee history associated with removal and renewal. These are all vitally important. And these are just two pretty Cherokee girls. So. So shortly after the April 2016 symposium I referenced earlier, a group of cheerleaders from Greenfield, Ohio made this banner. They were playing a team with the Indians as mascots, as I'm sure you can guess. They were, of course, roundly criticized, but unfortunately this echoes an almost identical banner that was used when the McAdory High School team was playing a rival school, also, guess what, with the Indians as their mascot. Then, in December 2016, in Ohio again, during a basketball game, a similar banner is seen. However, in this case, and I found this extremely interesting, school administrators said the students who created the banner said, quote, "The girls had no clue Trail of Tears referenced the forced migration of the Cherokee Nation, where several thousands of people died." And you may wonder, so how does this relate to your presentation, Condessa? The student looked for sign ideas online and saw the Greenfield banner and used the phrase without clicking on the story and without any understanding of what the phrase meant. So of course, Cherokee Nation did experience a trail of tears, but we are far from being alone in this ignominious moment in American history. So if we look away from the things in our history that make us feel uncomfortable, and if we fail to include those uncomfortable moments in discussions in education about that time period, if we minimize the things that might make us feel uncomfortable, feel guilty, feel bad, we run the risk of committing the same errors as these students. We run the risk of invoking the era without examining the ways problematic legacies continue to exist. I'm done. But I think we have a little time for questions, if anyone has any questions. And if I covered it all perfectly and everyone, if you have none, I understand.
Is this available if someone wasn't here? Is it something that you could read? Or?
Yes, right in the back, Eric is filming this.
Okay. I have a friend who would love this.
Yes, what do you think contributes to the massive amount of research that the Cherokee Nation does in contrast to many of the other nations? For example, if you were to go stand at the library and look at the volumes that the Cherokee Nation has been able to contribute to knowledge, and just go down, you might be lucky if you find one volume of anything on many of the nations. What do you think contributes to that? I find it very frustrating.
That is a great question. And the question, I'm not sure if everybody was able to hear it or not. I'll go ahead and I'll kind of boil it down. But she asked, why does it seem that the history of Cherokee Nation kind of dominates American Indian history, and particularly this moment in time? I made several references to the fact that the Cherokees were not the only one who had a removal, who aren't the only ones who had a Trail of Tears. And so she's asking, why do I think that the Cherokee Nation so dominates the existing literature that's out there? And the Cherokee were very good at adopting new technology, and with the advent of the printing press, they were able to create a bilingual newspaper that reached both Cherokee and English-speaking Americans as well. The paper was very well received, the Cherokee Phoenix. It was even sent overseas, and it was an advocacy, right? So I think that high level of advocacy that was taking place in Cherokee Nation, and Cherokee Nation, I think, was also the largest tribe in the Southeast at that particular moment in time. It led to kind of this moment in the popular Southern imagination in which Cherokee is almost used as a stand-in for Indian in a lot of different ways. And so there was this growing fascination with Cherokee people, Cherokee ways of life. You even see people who espouse views of white supremacy who have no problem tracing themselves to Cherokee ancestry, which I find really, really strange and antithetical. But a story was told to me by my former dissertation chair, and she was down visiting people who were claiming redness. So people who didn't necessarily have any kind of ancestry, but they're seeking to claim it. And she visited with this one gentleman, and he said, oh, we know that my great-grandmother was Cherokee. We know she was a full-blood Cherokee. She left us this list of words, and that's how we know. And he brought out this list of words, and it was a list of Creek words. And she says, this is a wonderful list, but these are Creek words. And he says, no, 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 they're Cherokee, because I know. So basically, he's using Cherokee as a misnomer for American Indian in the Southeast. And you see that time and time again. So I think that somehow that has kind of translated into the popular consciousness of Cherokee equals Indian, which we all know is absolutely false. You know, there are 569 federally recognized nations now in the United States. So there's a huge, broad diversity. And Cherokee also, because of our bilateral citizenship and no blood quantum, if you have Cherokee descent, you are a Cherokee. You know, if you are able to trace your ancestors back to the Dozerals, you are a Cherokee. It doesn't matter whether you're 1/8,000 or you're a full-blood. You are a Cherokee, okay? So I think that the combination of those things and our inclusive policy of citizenship helps contribute to kind of that overwhelming fascination as well.
Yeah, a lot of the focus of the literature deals with Indian Territory in Oklahoma, but there's also another story in Texas about the Cherokee.
Yeah.
And a fact that isn't known by many people is where Sequoia died.
Yeah.
You know, visiting Cherokees who were driven out by Mirabeau Lamar, the governor of Texas, you know, the massacres and so forth.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. That yes, that and actually, one of the early constitutions of the Cherokee Nation stated that in order to be a citizen, you had to be a resident. And that was something that was publicized to Cherokee citizens. So they knew that if they immigrated somewhere else, then they were effectively terminating their Cherokee citizenship, which is an unfortunate outgrowth for some of those individuals' descendants. But as you rightly point out, Sequoia did depart Cherokee Nation looking for other Cherokees who had gone to Mexico, and he expired in Mexico. There is actually a documentary being produced by, oh gosh, Leanne, what's her last name? Leanne Howe and Jace Weaver out of the University of Georgia, and it's called Searching for Sequoia. They've got a great trailer online. They've recently received funding, and they're going to pursue, they're going to follow in Sequoia's footsteps. They have located a church in Zaragoza that Sequoia visited, and hopefully, maybe that project will bring some answers there. Yeah.
Can you explain what the purpose of designating someone chief for a day that happened occasionally? I don't understand why it's just a day-long honor towards a white person, or?
Well, no, I don't think it was white people.
Oh.
I don't think so.
Oh.
I'm a little fuzzy on that history, to be honest, and I hate to say anything and speak out of turn. But I do know that after statehood, it was thought that statehood abrogated indigenous nationhood in Oklahoma. And that is what led Governor Alfalfa Murray to say that Oklahoma did not need to be a public law 280 state, which applied state jurisdiction to Indian territory, or Indian country, I should say, Indian lands, because he said, we don't have any Indians here. Now, the real punchline there is that Governor Murray was actually Chickasaw, and that's the reason why there's not a Chickasaw County, but there's a Murray County in Oklahoma. So during that time period, when it was thought that Indian nationhood was abrogated, although according to the 5 Civilized Tribes Act, the indigenous nations continued in full force and effect. rather than having an actual election, people were appointed to sign documents, so the so-called chiefs for a day. So W.W. Keeler was actually an appointed chief prior to the Cherokee Constitution being enacted after statehood, when he was duly elected.
Yeah, that thought crossed my mind, that the reason would be, then lands could be signed away if they found someone who was amenable to that, perhaps.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Okay, thank you.
Would you mention something about the Eastern Band of Cherokees, how that came about briefly?
Yeah, there are some really great things that have been written. John Finger wrote about the Eastern Cherokees as well. The Eastern Cherokees, there are a variety of ways in which the Eastern Band and their descendants came to be there in Cherokee, North Carolina. It is true that there are instances of people who hid in the hills and evaded capture, but it's also true that some individuals ceded Cherokee citizenship for state citizenship and for an allotment to remain there. Now, some of those families, I have met their descendants, and I have been told that they did that specifically to protect sacred sites in the East. Because, you know, we didn't just leave behind the property that was above ground, right? We left behind our ancestors that were buried underground. We left behind sacred sites where we danced. We left behind ceremonial areas where we did things like go to water. We left behind all those kinds of things. So I've been told by some modern day Eastern Band descendants of those original people who stayed behind that, so even some of those individuals who elected to stay behind lawfully, which was, I guess, for a time period an option, they did so with a motive of protecting specific places there. And I think it was around 1100 Eastern Band or 1100 Cherokees remained in the East. Unfortunately, I'm a little bit more knowledgeable about Oklahoma and as opposed to the Eastern Band history, but I appreciate that question. Thank you.
Were the early ancestors of the Cherokee ever known to be mound builders?
That's a good question too. Let's see. I know that there are mounds that exist in the Southeast, and that the Southeast is part of the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. However, whenever you start looking at, for instance, Spiro, it is said that those are likely the ancestors of Caddo and Wichita people rather than Cherokee people. And when you go up to Cahokia, those are they likely traded with Cherokee peoples. Unfortunately, again, I'm not quite as well versed on that topic as I would like to be, but I know there are mounds in the Southeast, but whether those are Creek origin, Cherokee origin, I'm not sure.
Thank you.
I was wondering if there was any documentation as to what happened to the slaves at John Ross Street in 1850?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. It would be something that you would have to look into. I'm sure that there's some WPA interviews that were done.
The band?
Yeah, and they're located at at the University of Oklahoma in Monette Hall as part of the Western History Collection. So there may be some things that you can track down that will give you some insight into those things. But I was very glad to see that Mary Stapler was able to convince John Ross to free all of his slaves 10 years prior to the passage of the 13th Amendment.
Hey, let's give Candessa another